I'll pick up exactly where you ended, I guess, because you were talking about the challenges to popular nationalism, and I will talk about sectarianism, which you mentioned also is the ugly counterforce or even the enemy of what you described of popular nationalism. And I think it's important to talk about this because sectarianism, or when talking about Syria, I think sectarianism is very often overestimated. When people describe Syria, the conflict in Syria as a sectarian war, or even a war about the right interpretation of religion, I mean, this is certainly not a good way of reading what is going on. But at the same time, I think it's also underestimated, the force of sectarianism. It's underestimated by analysts, but also by many Syrian activists, especially in the beginning of the uprising. But before I start, I'll say a few words about myself also. When I first came to Syria in 1998 to do research for my PhD thesis in anthropology for a German university, I did not imagine that I was going to spend most of the next 15 years in Damascus. My research at the time was on conservative Muslim women in Damascus and their distinctions between public and private life. So I spent much of my time in different women's circles, such as coffee mornings, reception days, and savings associations, having conversations with women and with men on how space and activities were divided according to gender, notions of modernity, and many other criteria. After completing my thesis in 2002, I went to Lebanon to work in a research project on demographic changes of a Beiruti neighborhood. I went back to Syria after that to live with my husband, an architect from Damascus, and later our two girls in Syria. I continued to work in different projects financed by the German Development Cooperation. First with the state institution, which was called the Agency for Combating Unemployment, which was an institution set up by the new, more or less, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad as part of the promised economic reform package. I was also for 9 months with one of the developmental NGOs under the patronage of the First Lady, Asma al-Assad, was called Firdos. And I have to say that both these jobs were a very rich and interesting experience, which offered very troubling insights into the Syrian reality. In my last 2 years in Syria, I joined UNRWA, which is the UN organization responsible for Palestinian refugees in the Middle East. And this is where I was when, in the end of 2010, we, like everybody else, closely followed the Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring, on TV. Until the Syrian revolution started in the small city of Daraa, south of Damascus, in March 2011. And we stayed glued to the screens, waiting for it to reach the capital and topple the regime. And as you all know, this never happened. And almost 1 year later, after our last visitor, Sofyan, as you mentioned, had packed his things and left, and in February 2012, we also gathered our things together and moved to Beirut, where I started working with the German political foundation, which I'm still with until today, the Friedrich-Ebert-Foundation. And in Beirut, I was, for the 3 years to come, I was responsible for building up the foundation's Syria office in Beirut, which aimed at supporting civil society initiatives and individuals in Syria and the neighboring countries, of course, Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan at the time. Individuals or groups which aimed to lay the foundations for a democratic transition and peaceful coexistence in Syria. In February 2015, exactly a year ago, After most Syrians I had been working with in Lebanon had already left to Europe or elsewhere, we finally moved to Berlin and basically followed the flow of Syrians, and where I continued to work with the Friedrich-Ebert-Foundation. Just a small footnote, although this is not the topic of my speech, in 2015, in Berlin alone, 18,500 Syrians registered as refugees. So it's, wherever I went, there were many Syrians in the last 15 years. To come back to the topic. Among the different failures of the so-called Arab Spring in the Middle East and North Africa, Syria is certainly the country which is currently experiencing its most cruel consequences. A horrendous war, human rights violations of all kinds, and a humanitarian catastrophe which has entered its fifth year. There have been many attempts to explain why things in Syria developed the way they did. And one of the aspects mentioned again and again is the sectarian diversity, on which what is often labeled as a sectarian war is now unfolding. Very often Syria is described as a sectarian mosaic that risks to fall apart. And this tends to give the impression of some kind of a sociological rule, like a logical consequence of the breaking down of a state rule, which previously guaranteed the coexistence of the various communities. Without any doubt, the integrity of Syria is currently being heavily challenged. The national borders are only partly under state control, and regional power struggles with a strong sectarian connotation, as well as interstate conflicts, are overlapping and carried out on Syrian ground. Nobody will deny that sectarian identity, as well as notions of belonging to a certain regional or ethnic group, are today assuming an unprecedented importance. Nevertheless, I insist to argue that it's not the sectarian diversity as such that determines the development in Syria. If this was the case, this would imply that a thorough analysis of the different determining factors would have allowed to forecast how likely a certain country's population would be able to succeed in the uprising or not. And there have been interpretations like this. Why did Tunisia succeed? Because it's a homogeneous country. And why did Syria fail? Because it's so diverse. And I think this doesn't go far enough into the topic. Because such an analysis, if you take these external factors and kind of calculate it all and come to the result, it excludes the influence and also the responsibility of the political relevant actors, which consciously opt for one action or another. I mean, there are actors in this. It's not only factors that determine the outcomes of a certain event. On the one hand, the influence of the regional powers such as Saudi Arabia and Iran, but also Turkey, is well known. Syria has been turned into a playground of international power struggles, which can be understood in the context of the larger Shia-Salafi competition in the area. This is what comes from outside, but there's something coming from inside also. And what we witness today, the upcoming sectarianism in Syria, is also, and I will go into this in more detail, is also the result of a policy which the Syrian regime has applied over decades and which has been reaching its peak in the last 5 years. The relations of peaceful or almost, or for long times, peaceful coexistence that prevailed among the various ethno-religious groups in Syria undoubtedly stood out as a social specificity which accounted for part of the country's special charm. And I think everybody who visited Syria knows what I'm talking about. And indeed, some high and low points notwithstanding, the various communities in Syria did live together, mainly peacefully over a period of many centuries. The tolerance shown by the various groups towards each other was a source of pride for many Syrians. often looking down on neighboring Lebanon with its recent history of 15 years of sectarian civil war. And many Syrians continue to refuse defining their identity through their belonging to a religious community, or to use the term of minority, as this implies the acceptance of the sectarian division of society, which is an idea which they refuse because of the ideological background, similar to what Yasser described, but also on the basis of the lived experience of respective tolerance and coexistence. The peaceful surface, however, often concealed a sense of mistrust and prejudice based on sectarian affiliation, which was not uncommon among Syrians even before 2011. Although topics such as sectarian identities or the relations between the different sectarian groups could not be discussed in public, they were a recurrent topic of private conversations, especially among the minorities themselves. In a country ruled by a regime that openly appointed people to positions of power and influence on the strength of their sectarian credentials, information on sectarian background of a person or group was often essential in order to understand the situation or to judge personal or professional possibilities and limits. To discuss ethno-religious differences in public, however, was equivalent to political dynamite and therefore taboo. Inciting sectarian tension was one of the standard accusations leveled at political dissidents in court, and it incurred a sentence of many years of imprisonment. The silencing of all debate on the sectarian makeup of the country did not succeed in banning it from reality, of course. On the contrary, it fostered ignorance about the religion of the others and thus nourished prejudice and sometimes far-fetched ideas about the way of life of people belonging to other sects. Just to give you an example of how this information was not passed on, at no time during schooling would a Syrian child learn which ethno-religious groups lived in his or her country. While religious education is compulsory in all public schools, it distinguishes only between Islam and Christianity, and the pupils are segregated accordingly. This means that Sunni, Alawites, Druze, Shiites, Ismailis, and Yazidis all participate in Islamic education without the differences between their religions ever being mentioned. Exploiting the mistrust created by ignorance, the Syrian regime has learned in its more than 40 years in power to play off the various groups against each other in order to maintain its hegemony. Many Syrians are aware of this and deplore the lack of information and opportunities for information exchange. And the resulting need for debate on the topics of Syrian identity and sectarian belonging has become evident over the last 4 years and projected these formerly taboo issues into the mainstream discourse. With the beginning of the Syrian revolution, sectarianism has become the subject of many heated debate. From the very beginning, the demonstrators were set to propagate sectarian slogans, the most famous of which supposedly was Alawites into the coffin and Christians to Beirut. I'll say it in Arabic so that it rhymes. It goes Al-Alawi ala Tabut wal-Masihi ila Beirut. The demonstrators declared this to be regime propaganda. And actually, it was never really clear whether it was really a slogan of a demonstration or it was made up to scare the mentioned minorities. So the demonstrators countered with slogans which emphasized national unity. Again, the most famous is 1, 1, 1. The Syrian people are one, which is Wahid, 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 Shab Suri Wahid. Or not Salafism, nor Muslim Brotherhood, the revolution belongs to the people. To reply to the accusation of being influenced and or financed by Islamist movements abroad. Bashar al-Assad spoke about the threat of Islamist terrorism as early as in March 2011, in his first speech before the Syrian parliament, when demonstrations were still peaceful and Islamist slogans rarely heard. At the same time, the brutal suppression of the protests began. Many peaceful, open-minded activists of those first months were arrested and killed, shot by the security forces or tortured to death in prison. Many others went into hiding or fled the country. Islamist groups gained ground, and the moderate and secular voices were forced into silence. Particularly harsh persecution awaited anyone who tried to play a mediating role, such as demonstrators who distributed flowers and water to soldiers, or minority community Syrians who joined the revolution or supplied humanitarian aid to displaced Sunni families. In a country where the free discussion of questions of identity had been suppressed for decades, the onset of a sectarian discourse caught the intellectual elite totally unprepared and led to a variety of reactions. The partly very emotional discussions and publications of the last 4 years are in stark contrast to the enforced silence over the past 4 decades. And this is a double-edged sword. Whereas a free and critical discussion of these issues is long overdue and essential in light of the current developments, the current focus on sectarian affiliations very often sidelines other, more decisive factors in the Syrian conflict, such as also the origins of the conflict, such as the development gap between rich and poor, rural and urban areas, and also the complex web of political and local relationships that often cut across religious and ethnic affiliations. One of the shortcomings of the Syrian opposition is undoubtedly that it has failed to attract more members of all religious groups. Of course, prominent and lesser-known members of all sectarian groups are represented in the opposition, and no community stands as a homogeneous bloc behind the regime. Most communities are divided on the issue of opposition, with regime supporters usually displaying their views outwardly, while regime critics keep a low profile because of security concerns inside the country. But members of non-Sunni communities generally do not have a significant influence within the Syrian opposition. On the other hand, Bashar al-Assad presents himself as the sole alternative to Islamist terrorism and as the protector of minorities, a narrative that the regime has reiterated on every possible occasion for more than 4 years. This, most cynically, has proved to be a successful strategy, insofar that as the international community has taken on board the idea that Assad is the better option, or at least for the minorities, especially the Christians. The sight of ISIS perpetrating its publicly displayed and mediatized atrocities has meanwhile reinforced the fears of the various sectarian groups. But this conclusion ignores the fact that it is the Syrian regime itself which is mainly responsible for the danger that the sectarian communities are currently facing. As early as 2011, it relinquished its power monopoly and encouraged members of these communities to form militias, armed them and allowed them to set up their own checkpoints, allegedly for their self-defense. By doing so, it gave credence to the notion of a Sunni majority threatening the existence of the minorities. By releasing Islamist prisoners and tolerating their coming to power as the Nusra Front and later ISIS, the regime reinforced the fears of the different sectarian groups in order to win their backing in its fight for survival. But the international community likewise bears part of the responsibility for the chaotic situation in Syria today. Its policy of non-intervention allowed extremist forces to become stronger, while all moderate and civil forces were abandoned to be slaughtered by either the regime or Islamist militias. Are non-Sunni communities currently under threat in Syria? It's a question that is often asked. In areas governed by ISIS as well as some of the other Islamist groups, this is certainly the case. In the other areas, they are threatened by oppression and war just as all other Syrians are. It should not be forgotten that so far the Sunni population has paid by far the highest price in terms of being victims of oppression, warfare, and displacement. A specific threat to minority sectarian groups can be identified in the fact that they are perceived by many to be supporters of the Syrian regime. A perception that could lead to acts of collective vengeance in the event that the regime were to fall. This danger is most obvious for the Alawites, but it's certainly a concern for other communities too, causing some to support the regime primarily for this reason. Another threat lies in the scenario of a Syria governed by Islamists, in which non-Sunnis would have no future. But here again, it is important to bear in mind that in this case, all secular and moderate forces, including all civil society organizations, would likewise be under threat. The fate of Alawites, Christians, Shiites, Ismailis or Druze therefore cannot be analyzed and discussed in isolation from that of the Syrian population as a whole. Despite the fighting, the human rights violations and all the atrocities, those struggling for the peaceful coexistence of all Syrians have not vanished. Many have gone into hiding or are keeping a low profile in order to survive the two-pronged opposition of the regime and the Islamists. Syria remains a diverse country, with virtually no region which is not home to a variety of sectarian and ethnic communities. It is important to note that local identities, such as being from Homs, rather than being Sunni or Alawite, often dominate sectarian concepts. There are many examples of contact, exchange, and support among sectarian communities on a local level, but such interaction is invisible to the international media. Massacres that don't take place don't qualify as headlines. It is important not to lose sight of the sensible, peaceful majority of Syrians who are threatened from all angles. They deserve international solidarity and support. Meanwhile, ending the Syrian conflict is the only way to salvage and re-establish the sectarian and ethnic pluralism which allowed Syrians to live together peacefully for centuries before the Assad regime took over power, and which it is to be hoped will continue to do so after its end. Thank you very much.